There comes a moment in many relationships where something just feels off. She used to call more often, she used to listen differently, she used to look at you like you were the center of her world, and now, she's distant, not gone, not angry, just pulling away. And that quiet distance? It can be more confusing than any argument, because when someone shouts, at least you know what's wrong. But when someone withdraws, you're left guessing. Today we're going to break this down in a deeper, more honest way, not from a place of blame, but from understanding. Because when you understand why she's pulling away, you also discover the one thing that often brings her back. Section 1. Pulling away is rarely random. One of the biggest misunderstandings in relationships, especially those that have lasted for years, is the belief that her distance appeared suddenly, as if something just switched off overnight. But the reality is far more gradual and often much quieter than that, because emotional withdrawal rarely begins with a single dramatic moment. It starts in the small, almost invisible spaces between everyday interactions where something meaningful was missing, where a conversation felt dismissed, where a concern didn't feel fully acknowledged, where she expressed something important and didn't see it taken seriously enough to create change. And over time, these moments don't just disappear, they accumulate, forming a pattern that slowly reshapes how she feels. Because at first, she likely leaned in more, not less. She may have tried to communicate more clearly, to explain herself in different ways, to give you opportunities to understand her perspective, and even to be patient when things didn't improve immediately. But when those repeated efforts don't lead to a shift in behavior or deeper connection, something inside her begins to recalibrate, not in anger, but in self-protection. Because no one wants to continue investing emotional energy where they feel unseen or unheard, especially later in life when people have already experienced enough to recognize when something isn't evolving. So instead of creating conflict or repeating the same conversations again and again, she starts to pull back little by little, becoming less expressive, less reactive, less emotionally available. And this is the part that often confuses many men, because there was no argument, no clear breaking point, no obvious sign that things were about to change. But the truth is, the signs were always there, just subtle enough to be overlooked. And by the time her distance becomes noticeable, it's usually not the beginning of the problem. It's the result of a process that has been unfolding for quite some time, which is why understanding this gradual shift is so important, because it changes how you respond. It moves you away from reacting to the symptom and toward recognizing the deeper cause behind it. 2. When emotional needs go unmet. As people grow older and gain more life experience, their expectations in relationships naturally shift from surface-level attraction to something far deeper and more meaningful, where emotional connection, consistency, and mutual respect become the true foundation of a lasting bond. And when a woman begins to pull away, it is often not because of something obvious or dramatic, but because certain emotional needs are no longer being fulfilled in a way that feels genuine or sustaining to her. Because over time, she starts to notice the subtle imbalances, the conversations that feel routine rather than engaging, the moments where she listens but doesn't feel equally heard, the times when her presence seems expected but not truly valued. And these experiences, while small on their own, begin to shape a larger emotional reality where she feels less connected than she once did. And what makes this even more significant for a mature or senior audience is that, at this stage in life, people are far less willing to tolerate emotional neglect or one-sided effort. They have already learned the cost of staying in situations that drain them, so instead of over-explaining or repeatedly asking for change, they often choose a quieter response, which is to step back and reassess their involvement, not out of spite or manipulation, but out of a desire to protect their emotional well-being. Because when someone feels like they are consistently giving more than they are receiving, it creates a sense of imbalance that slowly erodes the connection. And rather than forcing the other person to meet their needs, they simply reduce their own investment, becoming less available, less expressive, and less emotionally engaged. And this shift can feel confusing to the other person because it doesn't come with loud complaints or clear ultimatums. But the truth is, it reflects a deeper realization on her part that something essential is missing. And unless that emotional gap is acknowledged and addressed, the distance will continue to grow. Not because she wants to create separation, but because she no longer feels the same reason to stay as connected as she once did. 3. The more you chase, the more she retreats. When you begin to sense that she's pulling away, the most natural reaction, especially if you genuinely care, is to try and close that distance as quickly as possible, to reach out more often, to ask more questions, to seek reassurance that everything is still okay. And on the surface, that response comes from a good place, but in many cases, it creates the exact opposite effect of what you intend. Because when she is stepping back emotionally, it is often a signal that she needs space to think, to feel, and to regain her sense of clarity. And when that space is immediately filled with constant messages, repeated questions, or emotional pressure, it can start to feel overwhelming rather than supportive, because instead of feeling understood, she may feel like she is being pulled in a direction she is not ready for. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift in an unhealthy way, because the more you pursue, the more she feels the need to create distance to maintain her emotional balance, not because she wants to hurt you, but because she is trying to protect her own sense of peace. And over time, this can unintentionally turn into a cycle where your increased effort leads to her increased withdrawal, which then causes you to try even harder, creating a loop that becomes difficult to break. And for a mature audience, this pattern is especially important to recognize because emotional pressure at this stage of life is rarely received as passion. It is often perceived as instability or insecurity, and that perception can quietly reduce attraction rather than strengthen it. So the key is not to stop caring, but to change how that care is expressed, to move away from urgency and toward calmness, away from constant pursuit and toward balanced presence. Because when she senses that you are grounded, composed, and not reacting out of fear, it creates a different kind of energy, one that feels safe rather than suffocating. And in that space, she is far more likely to lower her guard and reconnect, not because she was chased into it, but because she feels free enough to choose it on her own terms. Silence doesn't always mean she doesn't care. One of the most difficult things to understand when a woman becomes distant is that her silence is not always a sign of indifference, because in many cases, she can still care deeply and yet choose to step back at the same time. And this is where emotional maturity becomes essential, especially later in life, because people no longer express their feelings in loud or dramatic ways. Instead, they often process things internally, quietly creating space between themselves and what is causing them discomfort. And when she does this, it is not necessarily because her feelings have disappeared, but because maintaining those feelings without feeling understood or fulfilled has become emotionally exhausting. And rather than continuing to invest energy into something that feels one-sided or stagnant, she begins to withdraw as a way of protecting herself, because caring without balance can slowly drain a person. And over time, even strong emotions can become heavy when they are not supported by mutual effort. So her silence is often less about not caring and more about no longer wanting to carry the emotional weight alone. And this is why reacting to her distance with frustration or assumptions can make things worse, because it overlooks the possibility that she is not trying to hurt you, but trying to regain her own sense of stability. And when you begin to see her silence through that lens, it changes your response. It allows you to approach the situation with patience and understanding rather than pressure, creating a space where reconnection becomes possible instead of forced. Be the one thing that brings her back. When a woman begins to pull away, most men instinctively believe the solution is to do more, say more, or try harder to win back her attention, but what actually brings her back is often the exact opposite of that impulse, because the real shift happens when you return to a place of self-respect combined with emotional awareness, where you are no longer reacting out of fear of losing her, but responding from a grounded understanding of yourself and the situation. And this creates a powerful change in energy, because instead of chasing her for validation, you become centered in your own value, and that calm confidence is something she can feel even without words. And when you give her space without resentment, without silent anger, and without trying to manipulate the outcome, it shows a level of maturity that is deeply attractive, especially for someone who is no longer interested in emotional games or pressure. And at the same time, emotional awareness allows you to reflect honestly on your own role in the dynamic, to recognize where you may have stopped listening, where you became too comfortable, or where you failed to meet her emotional needs. And this balance between self-respect and accountability is what makes the difference, because it shows that you are not only strong enough to stand on your own, but also wise enough to grow. And when she senses that genuine shift, not forced, not temporary, but real, it removes the tension that caused her to pull away in the first place, and creates a space where she can reconnect naturally, not because she was convinced or pressured, but because she feels safe, understood, and drawn back to a version of you that now feels different in all the right ways. 6. What this looks like in real life. In real life, this shift is not about dramatic gestures or sudden changes designed to impress her, but about subtle, consistent adjustments in how you carry yourself and respond to the situation. Because when a woman pulls away, the strongest move is often to slow down rather than speed up, to become more observant instead of reactive, and to allow space without turning that space into tension, which means you are not constantly reaching out for reassurance or trying to force conversations that she is not ready to have, but at the same time, you are not withdrawing in a cold or distant way either. Instead, you maintain a calm and steady presence, showing that you are still grounded and emotionally in control. And during this time, you begin to focus inward as much as outward, reflecting on your own behavior, your communication style, and the patterns that may have contributed to the distance. And this is where real growth begins, because rather than placing all the attention on what she is doing, you elevate your own mindset and actions, becoming more intentional in how you speak, how you listen, and how you show up. And this naturally changes the dynamic between you, because people respond differently when they feel a shift in energy that is authentic rather than forced. And over time, as she notices that you are no longer reacting with pressure or insecurity, but with patience and composure, it creates a sense of ease that makes it safer for her to reconnect. And whether that reconnection happens quickly or gradually, it is built on a stronger foundation, because it comes from genuine change rather than temporary effort. 7. Why this approach works, especially later in life. This approach becomes even more powerful and effective later in life because, with age and experience, people naturally begin to prioritize peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, and emotional stability over temporary excitement. And this shift changes the entire way relationships are experienced and maintained, because unlike in younger years where passion and pursuit might carry a connection forward despite underlying issues, a more mature perspective recognizes that long-term fulfillment comes from consistency, understanding, and a sense of emotional safety. And this is why chasing, overreacting, or trying to force closeness tends to have the opposite effect at this stage, because it disrupts the sense of calm that both people are seeking, and instead of feeling desired, it can make someone feel pressured or emotionally unsettled, which naturally leads them to create even more distance. But when you approach the situation with patience, self-control, and awareness, it aligns with what a mature partner truly values, which is someone who can handle emotional shifts without losing their balance, someone who doesn't need constant reassurance to feel secure, and someone who can give space without turning it into a silent conflict. And this level of composure stands out because it reflects inner stability, which is far more attractive than surface-level effort. And over time, this creates a dynamic where both individuals feel respected as independent people, rather than controlled or managed within the relationship. And that sense of mutual respect becomes the foundation for reconnection, because when she sees that you are not reacting impulsively, but responding thoughtfully, it builds trust in a deeper way, showing that the relationship can exist without unnecessary tension or emotional strain. And this is especially important for those who have already experienced relationships that were filled with conflict, misunderstanding, or imbalance, because they are far less willing to repeat those patterns. So when you embody calm confidence, emotional intelligence, and consistency, it not only reduces the reasons for her to stay distant, but also gives her a reason to come closer again. Not out of obligation, but because the connection now feels aligned with the kind of peace and maturity she is looking for at this stage of life. 8. When she comes back, don't repeat the same pattern. When she begins to come back, whether it's through small messages, renewed interest in conversation, or a gradual return of warmth, it can feel like a sense of relief, like the tension has finally passed and things are going back to how they were. But this is exactly where many people make a critical mistake, because they interpret her return as a signal that everything is fixed, when in reality it is simply an opportunity to do things differently. And if that opportunity is not handled with awareness, the same patterns that caused her to pull away in the first place can quietly resurface, because it's easy to fall back into old habits once the immediate pressure is gone, to become less attentive, less intentional, and more comfortable in ways that slowly recreate the same emotional gaps. And this is why consistency becomes more important than intensity, because what brought her back was not a temporary effort or a short burst of change. It was the shift in your mindset, your energy, and your behavior And if that shift fades, so does the reason she felt safe returning. And for a mature audience, this is especially important because repeated patterns are often easier to recognize and less likely to be tolerated, meaning that if she senses the same issues reappearing, she may choose distance much faster than before, not out of impatience, but out of clarity, because she has already experienced where that road leads. So maintaining the growth that reconnected the relationship requires ongoing awareness, where you continue to listen more deeply, communicate more intentionally, and remain grounded even when things feel stable again. And this doesn't mean overthinking every interaction, but rather staying aligned with the version of yourself that created the positive change in the first place. Because real connection is not rebuilt through momentary effort, it is sustained through consistent presence, mutual respect, and a willingness to evolve beyond the patterns that once created distance. 9. And if she doesn't come back? And then there is the reality that many people try to avoid but eventually have to face, which is that sometimes, even after you reflect, grow, and approach the situation with maturity and self-respect, she may still choose not to come back. And this can feel deeply disappointing, especially when you know you have made genuine changes. But this is where emotional strength and clarity become more important than ever, because her decision is not always a reflection of your worth. It is often a reflection of compatibility, timing, or a shift in what she wants for her life. And at a more mature stage, people tend to make decisions based less on emotion and more on alignment, meaning that even if feelings once existed, they may no longer be enough to sustain the connection in the way it needs to continue. And while that truth can be difficult to accept, it also carries a form of freedom, because it allows you to stop investing energy into something that is no longer moving forward, and instead redirect that energy toward your own growth, your own peace, and the parts of your life that still have room to expand. And this is not about giving up or becoming indifferent, but about recognizing when holding on is no longer serving you. Because real maturity is not just about knowing how to reconnect, it is also about knowing when to let go with dignity, without resentment, and without losing your sense of self in the process. And in many ways, this is where the deepest growth happens, because instead of defining yourself by whether someone stays or leaves, you begin to define yourself by how you respond to those outcomes. And when you carry yourself with that level of acceptance and strength, you don't walk away feeling like you lost something. You walk away knowing that you honored the experience, learned from it, and became a more grounded, self-aware version of yourself, which ultimately places you in a stronger position for any future connection that aligns more naturally with who you have become. So if she's pulling away right now, don't panic, don't chase, and don't lose yourself trying to hold on to someone. Instead, pause, reflect, and realign with the version of yourself that doesn't need to beg for connection, because he naturally creates it. Sometimes the strongest move you can make is not reaching out, but rising up. And in that space, you'll either draw her back or finally see clearly what truly belongs in your life.